Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Wallsend history story. This week I am covering a little bit of history about the building of St Mary's Church in Howdon, although it is correctly addressed as being in Willington, close to Willington Square. And I must add here that although I am referring to the church as St Mary's, the name outside describes it as St Mary the Virgin. Now, it's been a while since I have done any of these kind of videos because I haven't really had the time to sit down and write anything like this about Wallsend. So it is nice to now be able to get one or two of these more in-depth history stories recorded. It is possible that there had been a chapel of some kind in the area long before the current church was built. However, very little information about this remains, other than a small mention in the 12th century, but there are no details to say where this chapel might have been, and for the main part, the people of the area used Holy Cross Chapel and then later St Peter's Church. However, as the population grew in both Willington and the Wallsend area, the workload of St Peter's became too much and the parish of Willington was created. In the beginning, services were held in the kitchen of the home of a man by the name of John Oliver, who lived in Willington Square, and then later 2 cottages were converted and services were held there on a regular basis. Of course, this was not suitable as a long-term arrangement, and after some great difficulty in finding land to build a church on, the Reverend Geek was given the gift of an acre of land by John Henry Byrne of Tynemouth. The land at the time was valued at around £400, which today would be around £57,500, so this was indeed a very generous gift. Just to add a little here about John Henry Byrne, who was described at the time as a wealthy landowner with a big connection to the area of Willington. He was a colliery owner, having acquired West Stanley Colliery after the death of his father, and he also owned land at Willington, Little Benton and various parts of Durham. John lived at Beaconsfield House in Tynemouth, and he died in Yorkshire in December of 1898 at the age of 71 years. He had gone to Yorkshire for health reasons, having suffered with ill health for several years. However, his body was returned to Tynemouth after his death, and he was later buried at Jesmond Old Cemetery. He was said to be very well liked in the area and was known as a kind and generous man. Returning now to St Mary's, the church, which was designed by Austin and Johnson of Newcastle and would have space for around 300 worshippers, and the builders of the church were J and T Robson of North Shields. The cost to build was estimated to be around £2,700, and that's around £390,000 in today's money. A lot of the money had been raised, but there was a debt of around £1,500 at the time the building work began. The foundation stone was laid on the 29th of July 1874 by Master J. H. Byrne, who was the eldest son of John Henry Byrne, the man whose land the church was to be built on. And it seems that John Byrne Sr. felt that by allowing his son to lay the foundation stone, he would somehow be tied to the church for life and would worship there forever, a view that was also held by the Reverend Geek. Master Byrne had been presented with a silver trowel for the stone laying. This was quite a common thing for the laying of a foundation stone, and I do still wonder how much these trowels, and sometimes gold keys, would have cost, and if people actually kept them and passed them down the family line. So far, I have never found any evidence of any of them still being around today. The inscription on this particular silver trowel stated, "Presented by Mrs. Geek to J. H. Byrne, eldest son of J. H. Byrne, Esquire, J.P., on the occasion of his laying the foundation stone of St Mary's Church, Willington, 29th of July, 1874. The Reverend Geek spoke on the day of how difficult it had been to find land to build the church on, stating that they had been offered funds by the Bishop of Durham, but as they had not found anywhere suitable, the funds expired. He also stated that land had been offered further down Churchill Street, but this had been deemed to be too close to the pit shafts, as it was thought the pits may start working again very soon. He stated that he was most grateful to Mr. Byrne for the donation of the land which finally allowed the church to be built, and had happily agreed to allow his son to lay the foundation stone. The Reverend Geek also gave thanks to everyone who had helped making the building of the church possible, and he also said it was his belief that they would not leave him with the burden of paying off the money still owing for the costs to build. After the laying of the foundation stone, a tea was held in the marquee that had been erected near to the church especially for the occasion, and it was at this tea that the Reverend Geek spoke again of the money still owing on the building of the church. He stated that he had donated £250 himself and was prepared to donate the same again if 2 more men were willing to donate the same themselves. Unfortunately, the article does not say if anyone else pledged the money that the Reverend Geek had asked for. St Mary's was built without either a tower or a spire, but not all churches were built with these, and the church was said to be built in something that was described as the early English style of architecture. And at the time it was built on Churchill Street, which at the time was known as Copper's Lane, there was little to nothing around it, and the road leading to it was nothing more than a dirt track. Although the town was growing, it was still quite a distance away from the main areas of Howdon, so it must have been quite a trek uphill, albeit a slight incline rather than a steep hill, to get there in the winter when there was snow on the ground. Sadly, the Reverend Geek died in May of 1875, and he never saw the church built, which, considering how hard he had worked to find the land and build the church, is quite sad. His death was announced in quite a strange and simple way, but this was quite common at the time. It was stated that the day before his death he had been out and about, apparently in good health. Then the following morning he had had a fit and expired. They really did have a way with words in the past, and some of the ways that they describe people's deaths do seem quite strange to us when we read them in later years. The Reverend Geek's job at the not quite finished St Mary's Church was advertised in the papers not long after his death, where it was said that the position was worth £220 per year. Now today that would be around £32,500, so it was a very good wage for its time. And the Reverend Geek was succeeded by the Reverend H. Robinson, and he was the vicar of St Mary's when it was officially opened in 1876. The consecration of St Mary's was conducted by the Bishop of Durham, and he made mention of the sadness that the Reverend Geek had not lived to see the church built, after working tirelessly for 15 years to create the church that was at the time so badly needed. And after the service, a lunch was held in the schoolroom, and it was said to be a very joyous occasion. However, it had not all been good news, as it was said that John Henry Byrne had refused to completely hand over the land until a wall was built around the entire church, and the cost for this had been estimated at around £120, so the congregation of the church had quickly held events to raise the money for the wall to be built. They then had to work hard again to raise money for the purchase of paraffin lamps to light the church for evening services, and luckily this was quickly raised, and by September of 1876 the church was finally complete, with Mr. Dixon laying out the grounds around the church at his own expense. Strangely, although the land for the vicarage was acquired at the same time as the land for the church, and both were built around the same time, I was not actually able to find much information about the vicarage. However, if you look at this old photo of the area, you can see the vicarage and the church together. And the house is very impressive and a large building, and before the fields in front of it were built on, it must have been nice to live there with a view looking straight down towards the River Tyne. I did often wonder why a lot of the old vicarages was so large, but then I remembered that a lot of the vicars had large families, as large families were really, really common at the time. So they would have needed somewhere with a lot of rooms for the family and also space to meet with their parishioners when they called to the house, as they often did. Over the following years, many changes were made to the church, including the addition of the church hall, and the foundation stone for this was laid by Miss Robinson, who was the daughter of the then late Reverend Robinson. The church hall allowed for fellowship meetings and social meetings and was also used for the Mothers' Union, the guides, brownies, cubs, scouts, fairs and parties. Now, it does seem that the church was not in the newspapers much over the years. The majority of any stories that I found related to weddings taking place or the mention of a summer fair. I would imagine that many Wallsenders will have been married at St Mary's as well, though, and I was a bridesmaid there myself many years ago when I was just a child. And I'm sure that this photo that I've added here will actually give some people a few laughs. But anyway, I am sure that lots of you will have memories of the church, and I would really love to hear them in the comments below. And I'd also love to hear if you were married there too, because I really do love to hear people's memories of the places that I cover in these stories. Today, St Mary's is still very much in use. I have often seen weddings taking place there, and other events are held on a regular basis in the church hall. And like most churches today, they do rely on donations and fundraising, and it's a common thing to keep churches going, as costs for churches, like everywhere else, are always very high. And the church itself is a Grade 2 listed building. When I look back at Howdon and Willington and see how many of the old churches are now long gone, either demolished or used for a completely different purpose, it is nice to see that at least one of them is still being used for the purpose it was built for. I do hope that you have found this very short little video interesting and that you have enjoyed it, and that it's maybe brought back some happy memories for you too. And I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again next week.